opportunities does that offer us that we might not have thought of before? Now, some of this is going to be quite controversial, and I'm happy to take any feedback and any pushback at any time. There's a lot of thinking in that I've been looking at over the past 25 years. My conservation career, and I've worked as a conservation scientist and practitioner and writer, pretty much entirely focused on Indonesia, to a lesser extent Malaysia, and within Indonesia even geographically quite strongly on the island of Borneo, both the Malaysian and the Indonesian side, and within that very strongly focused on orangutan conservation. I started as an MSc student in 1991. Was tasked to survey the entire island of Borneo and develop the first maps of orangutan distribution. And I want to start building on that, the lessons I've learned, the ideas I've picked up, and see how that reflects to the way we're going about conservation today. So I'm talking about the challenges that poses, but also very much about the opportunities that kind of thinking offers us going forward in Asian conservation in the Anthropocene. And for those not familiar with the term Anthropocene, it's not generally accepted yet, but there's a lot of thinking that this is going to be a new geological era or epoch that is going to be recognized in the long-term future, millions of years from now, because the modern humans have such a big impact on the planet that we're going to trace this back within the geological record in the future. There's going to be a clear signal in the geological record to show that we were around and messed up this planet, which is pretty much what we're doing. So let me explore that a little bit. And I wanted to start with a presentation I was watching some time ago by the very well-known Professor Jeffrey Sachs. I don't know whether you're familiar with him, but he is the brain behind the Global Happiness annual reports that are being developed. He is one of the contributors to the development of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, very active writer. He's a well-known economist. He writes for newspapers, he writes books. And I saw him in a presentation in Malaysia, and the first time I saw him, I was really taken by the lucidity, the clarity of his thinking and the clarity of his presentation. And his presentation was generally about the global sustainability challenges that are being posed right now. And they focused on three main trends that he recognized. First of all, he discussed a global economic shift back to the east. And I picked up this map from the internet. I think it's a very cool map. It shows, I don't know whether you can see this from the back of the room, but it shows the economic center of gravity and how it's shifted over the past 2,000 years across the world. So basically, per country, the authors or the makers of this map try to estimate the gross domestic product, the GDP, for each of the regions in the world, and developed a global center of gravity. So where was that economic power concentrated? And you can see here at 180, the global center of gravity for economic power was sort of on the eastern border of what is now Afghanistan, just about going into Pakistan. And it sat there for 1,000 years. That's where global economic and political power was concentrated in that part of the world. And then slowly it starts shifting west over 1500, 1820, as industrialization kicks in on the back of colonialization, of slavery and so on. You get a massive shift from between 1820 to 1913 to the west, and then it kind of meanders throughout the 20th century, in the 40s, 50s. It doesn't quite make it to Greenland, and then starts shifting back slowly, 1990, 2000. And as of 2010, it makes a massive jump back east, and the prediction in 2025 is that it's firmly back in Asia. So you can safely say that global economic and political power over the past 2,000 years has firmly been embedded in the Asian continent, apart from 200 years when it shifted west towards the Americas and Europe, and it's on its way back now. And I think it's an important trend to recognize in terms of what it means, in terms of our work, in terms of our conservation, in terms of the challenges, as well as the opportunity it poses in our work. The second trend that Jeffrey Sachs picked up on, and this is what most of us are professionally working on, is global climate change and the massive biodiversity declines that we're facing around the globe. He's arguing, and I'm very much onto that, that it's a fundamental threat to humanity. The way we're undermining the function of ecosystems, the way we're losing our biodiversity. This is not just about the species that we're working on, the elephants, the tigers, the orangutans, but it cuts through pretty much the entire ecological world and is posing real challenges. Now, we're all very much aware of this, and politically, very slowly, this starts to be picked up and becomes a theme on the political agenda of the most important countries. But it's going to determine a lot of what this planet is going to look like and how we're going to function as people on this planet. Now, the third trend he focused on was rapid technological change, and that's the one I'm least familiar with. I can hardly get my WhatsApp going. But I know it's changed my life. Stuff that it took us weeks 20 years ago, statistical analyses are just a push of a button now and it rolls out and we have the data. So there's clearly a massive change happening in our lives, facilitating things, providing threats, but also providing lots of opportunities. Jeffrey Sachs was arguing that, of course, a lot of this is going into warfare, into weapon development and so on, and somehow we need to push that technological change into areas that have greater societal and environmental benefits. Now let's explore these three trends a little bit more going forward in Asia. And I've picked up a few maps, including this weirdly, it almost resembles a heartbeat, the global heartbeat, which in fact it is. And each of these maps is one of these maps where the geographic area of countries has been rescaled according to particular indicators. So the countries, the size of the countries in these maps represents the global share of the particular indicator that country has. And the top one on the left is the world population, where you can see that the Americas are becoming really small, Africa is rather big, Europe is pretty much gone, Australia has disappeared pretty much entirely, but the big blobs in the map are India and China. Of course, we know very large human populations there and still growing, but again, that's important for our conservation thinking. The second map shows the gross primary productivity, which is basically the transition from sunlight through photosynthesis into energy. And this is why it kind of blobs up and down, because through the calendar year it runs through 12 months. With the shifting of the seasons, the gross primary production shifts across the world. Now, if you look at Asia, and apart from the tropics and apart from Siberia that really strongly comes up, or Russia in the northern summer, the gross primary production is actually a relatively small landmass. And of course this is important because all of this is related to food production. If you have this huge number of people on the continent, there's going to be a massive demand for agricultural and other products, and somehow they need to be produced. This is going to be a challenge because all of this relates to land use, and at the moment about 50% of land is used in Asia for agricultural production. That leaves 50% for other things, and of course that's where often we find our one of challenges. The third map I wanted to pick up on is the percentage of urban population in each of the continents or each of the countries. And again, India and China stand out relatively, as well as Europe, for having relatively large urban populations. And I think it's important insofar that, from what I understand, there's a number of studies that have looked into this, especially in the United States and in Europe. In terms of perception and support for conservation, quite often urban populations are a lot more supportive. And I think this provides opportunities for Asia, with a lot of people residing in cities. Of course, you're taking pressure of rural lands, and potentially this is where a lot of your political power sits in terms of influencing elections and so on. So I wanted to highlight that as an opportunity to start thinking about who actually supports conservation and where and why, and what can we do with that information to help us guide our work. So what does it mean, the Anthropocene? As I said earlier, it's a geological concept that basically thinks that we're going to have a massive, and we are having a massive influence on what the planet looks like. And I wanted to just tell you a little story. Over the past 25 years, as I worked in Southeast Asia, I've actually spent very little time in where I'm from, in Europe. But this year we were back, and we decided to let's just check out Europe's nature. And we went to the Alps. The Alps, you can see it from space, is this big mountainous area, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, France, Italy, Liechtenstein, that stands out as a green heart of Europe. So we're excited going there, and ended up in this lovely valley in far western Italy, Italian Alps, a dead-end valley that goes straight into the high mountains. Beautiful old towns, beautiful old agricultural systems of people moving cattle and sheep up and down the high altitude mountains. There were wolves coming back in, so that the herds were guarded by these massive sheepdog that are basically growing up with the sheep flocks and behave like sheep, apart from the fact that they bark a lot and get very aggressive when there's wolves around. But it's really kind of traditional area, and we did a lot of hiking there. We saw a lot. One thing I didn't see at all, pretty much in 5 weeks in the Alps, which I want to touch on later, is I didn't see any wildlife. I saw a couple of birds, but I spent 5 weeks hiking without seeing a single rabbit, hare, roe deer, wild boar, red deer, fox, badger. It appeared to be devoid, and I want to touch on that later. But what I did notice sitting in these areas is how fundamentally these areas have been modified by people. You look at this picture and you think, well, of course there's a little village there, and the rest looks kind of natural. But sitting in the landscape, looking at where meadows were, where trees were, where rocks were, I came to realize that every element in the landscape, apart from the mountains themselves, had been fundamentally put there by people. Every tree was there because someone in the past decided that that tree was going to fulfill a certain function, either as for production of firewood, either for keeping houses away from. There's quite a lot of snow cover there, snow off the houses, for fodder, for winter feeding of cattle. Every tree was there because someone had decided they wanted that tree there. But even to the extent of rocks, I mean, every rock that feasibly could be moved by people had been moved. You could just see it. I mean, they were piled up, they had been removed from fields and so on. So you just start to think about how fundamentally these landscapes have changed. And in itself, I don't think this is necessarily a problem. I remember very clearly from my botany lectures at university when I was a student that apparently the Netherlands, where I'm from, had the highest biodiversity in its entire history in the 16th, 17th century. The Netherlands, of course, is a coastal swamp with probably a lot of wet areas, wet forest. But according to the botanists, only after thousands of years of tinkering, of moving soil up there, taking soil away there, keeping this dry, making that wet, fertilizing that patch, scraping off that patch, that's how we developed our highest biodiversity. And since then, of course, it's declined again once you go into the homogenization of landscapes with larger fields, more industrial agricultural types and so on. So I don't think necessarily human interference with landscapes is undermining biodiversity. I think there can be a lot of value in there, but that balance needs to be right. And that balance is going to be something that's going to challenge us in places like Asia, but also something we need to start keeping in mind. Now, this fundamental changing of landscapes, I don't think is unique to places like the United States or Europe. I think it's actually everywhere, and I think we probably underestimate the extent to which people have influenced even places like the deep interior heart of Borneo. We tend to think of Borneo, the third largest island of the world, as this massive island covered in rainforest, of course. It's lost quite a bit of its rainforest. There's probably about 45% of rainforest left. But even there, you could fly in a helicopter for hours over expanses of unbroken rainforest in the center of the island. What I wanted to emphasize, and this is a photo taken from one of these helicopter flights, probably one of the most remote villages you could probably find anywhere on Borneo. It takes a good 5-6 days traveling up the main river, tributaries, and smaller, across the rapids before you get there. And it's a tiny village, 30 houses, maybe 200 people there. And you think the impact of those people on the environment around them is really quite limited. Now, and you're not going to be able to see this from the back of the room, but what I've put next to it is a map from the Colonial Era. I think it's 1850. The Dutch, who were the colonial rulers at the time in Indonesia, put a lot of effort into accurately mapping where everything was, all the little villages, all the little paths across mountains between villages. And what we see as one village now was actually 5 or 6 villages 150 years ago. And I think we tend to forget that places like Borneo, a lot of people lived in the interior. At the moment, everyone lives at the coast because that's where the agricultural activities are and so on. You look at peat swamps, which is of course, we all hear about peat swamps, we hear about fires, we hear about carbon emissions, we hear about haze, we hear about the great home of the orangutans. We talk about these peat swamps like of course, they are unique and super important, but I think they're so important because no one ever lived in peatlands. If you look at these same colonial era maps for the peatlands, they're white blocks. There's not a single village anywhere close to these peat swamps. Why? Because it's totally unsuitable for agriculture, smallholder agriculture. It's pretty unpleasant. It's wet. It's mosquito-ridden. So no one lived in those. People lived inland, and we're having a significant impact. And it's an impact I want to talk about and explore a little bit more. Building on the case of the orangutan. So the orangutan, I think for the past 30, 40 years, it's one of the most researched species in the whole of Asia, I would say. Maybe next to tiger and elephants, probably even more than those two. We've created this standard view as scientists, as commentators, as people from the media, of the orangutan being the symbol of untouched rainforest. It's a solitary ape compared to the other great apes, the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the gorillas that have much more social lifestyles. The orangutan is a solitary one. It lives at low densities, maybe 2-3 animals per square kilometers. A square kilometer, that's a big patch of land. Having 2 animals in you're almost by yourself. And that's the picture we've generated. Highly sensitive to ecological disturbance. You do a little bit to a forest, the orangutan is going to suffer. Orangutans are always up in the tree. They're designed as brachiating species. Morphologically, they're designed to be up on trees, moving through the canopy. You do something to the canopy, the orangutan is going to suffer. Now, this is the picture we've been building up. I think every aspect of the things I said earlier is fundamentally wrong. And it's wrong because the deeper we look at the species like orangutans, the more we understand that it's actually a totally different species. Orangutans are ecologically really quite versatile. We've been studying orangutans in vast tracts of monocultural pulp and paper plantations existing of Acacia mangum, not even a native species. And I'm never going to call an Acacia mangum population a suitable orangutan habitat. Nevertheless, we find significant densities of orangutans there that survive primarily on stripping bark and feeding on the sweet cambium of Acacia mangum, then going back into forests. The same with oil palm plantations. Of course, the narrative is oil palm is the great threat to orangutans. Forget about it, it is not. And I'll get to that back later. Again, I'm not going to call an oil palm plantation an orangutan habitat. But we do know that within the matrix that most orangutans survive in at the moment, at least in Borneo, about 25% of orangutans are within protected areas. 75% sit in this matrix of all sorts of different uses, timber concessions, oil palm, pulp and paper, rubber, smallholder agriculture. So that really is our biggest focus. That's where we need to focus our conservation solutions. Within oil palm plantations, orangutans, they nest on oil palm, they start feeding on oil palm fruits. It's something that, of course, chimpanzees do and use tools to do in the native conditions where oil palm in Western Africa originates. Orangutans start doing that as well. They certainly use oil palm as a transitional habitat, moving between forest patch A to forest patch B. So our view that orangutans are basically going to disappear as soon as you do anything to a forest is wrong. And this is even clearer in selectively logged timber concessions. This was the first enemy of the conservation community in places like Borneo. We absolutely hated timber concessions because they were destroying the forest, as ultimately they did. But ecologically, we now learn that orangutans are perfectly happy in a selectively logged timber concession. The light that comes to the forest floor generally stimulates the growth of a lot of pioneer species that are generally fruiting quite frequently, which orangutans like. The only thing that orangutans really can't stand is being killed, as a lot of other wildlife. But orangutans more so, as they cannot recover. This is the work done by the captive breeding specialist group at the time. The population viability modeling clearly shows that any populations that you have, no matter how large they are, if you take out 1% of the population per year, that population is going to go extinct within the foreseeable future. So they're very slow breeders. The orangutan mothers keep their babies for 6-7 years. So their ability to recover from any kind of mortality is really low. So we know orangutans are ecologically very versatile. We also know that hunting plays a major role in their declines. We've been able to quantify through a number of studies the number of orangutans that are annually being killed on Borneo, and it's the big driver of change for orangutan population. They can survive in a lot of ecological conditions, but that killing factor is one that they're really struggling with. And I think this is the story of orangutans for much of the past 80,000 years or whatever, that they have coexisted, in which they've coexisted with modern humans. Or modern humans, we can't exactly time it, but they moved from Africa into Asia probably around 100 or 80,000 years ago, and the orangutans are there. And from there on, we can see this in the fossil records, things are starting to look quite bad for orangutans. Now, the standard story is always, as you go through the late Pleistocene, that the last glacial maximum starts kicking in, you get a massive change in vegetation types, and that really brings, because the orangutans used to occur all the way up into southern China, into Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Peninsula Malaysia, Peninsula Thailand, including the island of Java as well in Indonesia, all places where they've now gone extinct. Now, the standard story is, because they were so ecologically sensitive, the changes that were caused about global climate change, the cooling, the drying of climate, basically wiped out the orangutan. We now think, and published this in a paper quite recently, that probably human killing was the main driver. And I think that not just has this changed the orangutan, has this led to the local extinction of orangutans, I really think it has fundamentally changed the orangutan as well. And that's something I want to touch on. For example, the orangutans were, as I said earlier, supposed to be fully arboreal. And they are. I mean, if you study orangutans, they're always up the tree. The only thing is, if you start putting camera traps on the ground, they're very often on the ground. They're just not going to be there when you're there, because that generally means bad news for the orangutan. So I think a lot of that we see at the moment in orangutans, their low densities, their behavior, their arboreal behavior, somehow relates back to their hunting history. And we think that's the case. When we look at the fossil record, that's really quite surprising. There's fossil finds throughout mainland Southeast Asia of orangutans, and quite often, more often than not, they're the second most common species within the fossil records. Pigs are most common, and then you get orangutans. Now, of course, that's totally not in line with their current densities. I mean, if you look at the current densities of orangutans compared to other species, deer and pigs, and leaf monkeys and macaques and so on, everything else that is also in the fossil record, orangutans are way down there. They're a really quite rare species. So what was going on? Why were they so common in the fossil records? Were there much more orangutans? Were they targeted by hunters at the time? And we're talking about hunters 50,000 years ago, so no advanced blowpipes, and people were hunting with maybe with dogs or with spears or with primitive bows and arrows. It's not easy to kill an orangutan up a 50-meter high tree with a bow and arrow. So something weird's going on. And if you then look at the genetics, we see that orangutans have declined by at least 3 orders of magnitude. That's what's sort of suggested by the genetic signal. So there's a lot of tentative, and nothing is really concrete, but a lot of tentative evidence that indicates that orangutans were vastly more abundant than they are now, probably lived at much higher densities than they are living now. And that also means that our assumption about carrying capacity of habitat now are probably wrong, and you could probably sustain a lot more orangutans within a given piece of habitat than we're thinking now. Again, nothing of this is concrete, nothing of this is solidly proven, but I think it's worth thinking about the extent to which we as humans have actually changed orangutans, because it also means that orangutans potentially have much greater ecological flexibility to survive, which informs conservation strategies. Now, I'm going to talk about a far more interesting species, wild pigs. People always want to talk about orangutans. They're all over the social media. I think wild boars are very cool, and all wild pigs are very cool. Smart species, much more important to rural communities. If I sit down in a longhouse in Borneo, talk about orangutans, people invariably fall asleep within 2 minutes. If I talk about bearded pig in this case, we can talk for 3 days and they'll still come up with new hunting stories. So clearly it resonates, it's important. And I wanted to touch on this species again because there's tentative evidence that the species itself has fundamentally changed. And I'd like to hear opinions later in discussions of what you think about these ideas. I picked up on the fact that wild boar is one of the species I'm interested in. Of course, within the wild pig specialist group we have, in terms of conservation, much more important species that are that could even be extinct in the wild, like Visarian warty pig, pygmy hogs in Assam, India, that are just slowly starting to recover again, but also are critically endangered. The wild boar is actually doing quite well. In Europe, it's one of the species that through rewilding efforts and through changes in societal attitudes and changes in land use and changes in hunting intensity is coming back. And I'm interested in this recovery process because if you can do it for one species, what does it tell us for other species that need that help so much more? But one thing I picked up on, and I started to scratch my head about, is the wild boar went extinct on the British Isles probably in the 13th century. That's a pretty large piece of land, from all the way up in northern Scotland to South England, all the way to Western Ireland. People, and at the time there were about 1.2 million people in the whole of the British Isles, managed to eradicate every single last wild boar. Now that's quite something. Of course, it was done to other species as well. But where I find this strange is when I talk to conservation managers in places like where wild boar currently are a threat to conservation because they're feral, like Australia, New Zealand, the United States. Pretty much everyone that works professionally on trying to eradicate pigs has given up on it. You just can't do it. You can possibly do it in very small geographic settings like the Galapagos Islands, but eradicating pigs in Queensland, forget it, it's just not going to work. And that's with all the technological knowledge, with poisoning opportunities, with hunting opportunities, shooting from helicopters, large capture operations, the pig always wins. So why were people 700 years able to eradicate pigs from the entire British Isles that we now consider totally impossible to do? What has changed? Were the people so much more effective with their primitive hunting methods, or has the pigs changed? And I leave that as a question because I simply don't know, but I'd like to explore the opportunities which we're doing through research with the University of Oxford at the moment, that something fundamentally has changed with the wild boar. Whether that's wild boar exchanges genetic material quite frequently, we know that with domestic pigs, whether it picked up genes for increasing reproductive output. Maybe wild boar traditionally, or 600, 700, 800 years ago, produced 5 young per litter, and then producing 10 young per litter, anything like that. We don't know, and there's of course no data on that. But I think something may have changed, and I think it's another example where through human pressure, species have adapted, and I think we need to keep that in mind. How am I doing for time, Ani? You all right? Yeah? Okay. I started off with 25 slides, and I ran through them a couple of times, and every time at 45 minutes, I got to slide 10, so I thought I had to dump a lot. I quickly want to touch on this. Another pig species, the pygmy hawk. And again, it's one of these things that I thought about that just don't quite add up. Traditionally, pygmy hawks, this critically endangered species, tiny little bullet-sized pig of tall Himalayan grasslands, has been thought of as a super ecological specialist. It occurred in that grey band across the map from western Nepal through Bhutan, through the Indian states of Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, but always in these tall sub-Himalayan grasslands where it co-occurs with tigers and rhinos and elephants and so on. So that was always the story, and it was nearly extinct and been brought back through effective captive breeding, release programs, and it's doing reasonably well at the moment. Now I came across, digging through the archaeological literature, across an obscure paper where a similar species was described, actually almost the same as pygmy hawk, that went extinct became extinct about 10,000 years ago, but it occurred in Java, Burma, and eastern China. So you have something that is very closely related to the current pygmy hawk, probably ecologically quite similar, but occurred pretty much to the whole of Southeast Asia, including the island of Java. And that started to, again, trigger thinking, like, are we getting things right? Is this habitat that pygmy hawks use of tall grassland, is that really the only place they can live in? If something very closely related occurred through the entire continent, do we need to look at that and start rethinking what the actual ecological requirements of the species are? I'm going to leave it there, otherwise I do run out of time, but I wanted to highlight it as an example where I think sometimes we get stuck on certain ideas, whether it's with orangutans, whether it's wild boar, whether it's pygmy hawk, whether it's any other species. What is remarkable about the orangutan is that there's probably, I don't know, something like 4,000 scientific studies on orangutans. If I'm indeed right that we're fundamentally missing part of the picture of orangutans, it also means that 4,000 research groups have fundamentally missed the picture, which is quite a concern. I would say that and I think part of that is people work in very narrow contexts. Most of the orangutan studies on behavior of orangutans are invariably done within protected areas. So relatively good quality forests. No one studied orangutans in timber concessions, oil palm concessions, pulp and paper concessions, because that's not cool, that's not where you hang out. You want to go deep inside the forest. So you see what you want to see, because you're looking at a very restricted part of the picture. And I think that's one of the problems in conservation science that we're dealing with. And of course now people are looking much more into these disturbed landscapes, so it's changing. So what does it mean, this kind of thinking? What does it mean for how we think about conservation strategies and how we go about studying species and so on? I think we need to always